welcome back. We are going to be starting session 2, which is the value of life and the preborn. So we're going to let Bruce take off with this. Thank you, Bruce.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we as Christians believe is that every human being was created in the image of God. This comes from Genesis 1:26 through 28. And it effectively says we share a common nature and bear the image of God, our Creator, designed with an intention and purpose. It means that we are set apart from the rest of creation. What it doesn't mean is that the rest of creation doesn't have like feelings or anything like that. Sometimes we get in a little bit too nuanced of an argument there, but it effectively just says that God has created us in His image, that we are set apart in that. And we're going to unpack some of the nuances that have come through with pro-life, pro-choice arguments over the past several decades and help you think clearly, biblically, biologically about what it means to value life and the preborn.
Genesis 1:26 through 28 says, "And then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.' So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female. He created them, and God blessed them."
Yeah. So what we're saying in this passage to you as you think about your role in mentoring is understanding that being created in the image of God means that every single one of us is a living, breathing reflection of who God is. Like we are this walking image of who God is and what He wants. And so as we live out that intention, that and purpose, it doesn't just start whenever we come to know Christ later on in life. It starts from the moment of fertilization, from the moment that we are uniquely created in our mother's womb. And we haven't always known all the intricacies of what happens in the womb. We'll unpack some of the biological truths that we're going to get to see that are just amazing about how awesome our God is and how He created us. But we do know that the Hebrews, as they were writing Scripture, even those in the New Testament, understood that God valued life from the very earliest moments of conception in the womb. So the next passage that really comes to mind that I think is probably one of the clearest statements about God's value for life in the womb is Exodus 21:22 through 25.
"When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her should surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe."
Yeah, so I didn't understand this passage. I don't know that I knew it existed whenever I went, hey, I'm pro-life. So I couldn't have unpacked all the intricacies of what we find in Scripture. There are other passages we're going to unpack here in just a second as well that help us reveal and understand how God values life from the moment of conception. However, this passage specifically, I think, is the most clear that says, look, there is justice required for the preborn when life is lost. And many of our laws uphold that. Like we have it where if a pregnant woman is killed in a car accident, that the person on the other end could be guilty for double homicide. Mm-hmm. However, today we would say in our laws that the only people able to get away with the crime of homicide or murder is an abortionist and the woman who is choosing to have an abortion. And so this passage very clearly says, look, no, if people are striving and a woman is injured and she or her preborn child are injured, life for life are demanded. That's what justice would have us follow. That's what the Bible would have us follow. So the other thing that I would say is people that I've engaged with have said, well, if you look at that, it could be interpreted that the woman, if she's injured or her life is taken, then that's when life is required, but not necessarily for the preborn. And I would just go, look, that is foolishness. We are trying to circumvent what Scripture in a most common sense way would have us interpret. Why would the author of Exodus even mention that she is pregnant if he does not intend for the woman and her preborn child to fall under the second half of that passage?
Psalm 139:13 through 14 and 16. "For you formed my innerwood parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it well. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written with every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them."
So Psalm 139 is kind of the pinnacle passage that we all turn to when we think of the value of life of the preborn. However, we don't take a lot of our theology from poetry because it is typically hyperbole, and that's why passages like Exodus 21 are so important. On the other hand, we don't diminish poetry just because it is poetic. We do want to take a look at it and go, hey, within the scope of what this literature is and the genre that it is, what is God saying? And I don't know that anyone could walk away from reading Psalm 139 in its entirety, especially these verses, and go, God didn't have something going on in the womb that he treasured, that he valued, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And we want to make sure we're not just conveying that truth to women for their preborn child or for the infant that they might be caring for. We also want to make sure we convey that to every single woman and man that we engage with.
Luke 1:44, for behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy.
So I love this passage in part because of the Greek word that is used for baby. So the baby in the womb, the Greek word for the baby in the womb is brephos. And it is actually a part of where the word embryo comes from. However, a few verses later, whenever Elizabeth and Mary are talking about John the Baptist out of the womb, the very same Greek word is used for the word baby. So it's not just baby in the womb is one word and baby out of the womb is another word. Baby in the womb and baby out of the womb are both brephos, both embryo. So the next thing that we want to unpack, it really is a shift in the way that we have thought about life. One of the things that happens in a lot of the arguments that are made when we talk about the value of life is we move from a biological argument to a philosophical one. So biologically, we know that life begins at fertilization. Embryologists, those who study life in the womb, would tell you they all agree life begins at the point of fertilization. We have unique human DNA at that point. That is a separate, whole, individual human being, even though that individual is still within its mother's womb. However, what happens is we go, okay, we know that that's a human being, or we know that those cells are, that embryo is human, but is it a person? And so the influences that this argument has made has really shifted our laws and grown in this secular view about the value and the justice or protection that we give to life, to these individual human beings at the very earliest stages. Like even with frozen embryos that are dealing with in vitro fertilization, we often talk about those, and our laws treat them as if they are property rather than whole human beings that are suspended in time being frozen. And so it's not neutral. It's based on materialism and evolutionary theory. And so in the late 1800s, Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, was known as the father of eugenics. And eugenics stands for good genes in Latin. And what he was doing was applying a lot of the ideas of evolutionary theory to human beings and just saying, look, we want to promote the most fit, the most competent, the most capable, the most athletic. And unfortunately, I think maybe what's obvious is what that meant is that they wanted to promote people that were looking like them, that lived like them, that did things they did. And what it meant is they devalued others to the point of effectively saying, we want to pull those people out of the gene pool. We don't want them reproducing. And so if you were poor or if you were a minority, you were considered unfit. And we did things like forced sterilization, where women of color were often, if they committed a crime or were connected to something, then they would be forcefully sterilized so that they could not have any more children. This is the type of law that went on all the way through the 1980s. And this idea is that the physical world is all that exists. So we as believers would say, no, of course, like you have a spirit and a soul, and the Bible connects those ideas from the point of fertilization. It's not like there's just some pre-existent soul waiting and God's kind of waiting until you get to a certain point of maturity in the womb, and then he attaches a soul to a body. From the very get-go of life, that soul and that body exist together all the way throughout our existence, even into eternity. There's not even a concept after death where it's like, hey, you've got this soul kind of floating around in some ethereal space. You were given a perfected body whenever Christ comes back, whenever Christ returns and creates a new heaven and a new earth. And so I realize that that's some theological complexity that maybe you haven't unpacked before, but we want to make sure that you're theologically sound as you move forward and as you might engage some different people on personhood theory or these ideas of like, well, when is a human being really a person? We don't want to get lost in, well, what about a heartbeat, or what about pain capable, or what about viability, or things like that? Because what it does is it effectively says these are people who have a right to life and these are people who can be murdered. And that's just not just, it's not true, it's not what we find in Scripture. So when you look at some of the legal decisions that have been made in our country, specifically with the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade or Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which are the big federal court decisions that were made that justified abortion, the Supreme Court upholds that the status of a living human being does not necessarily give a moral and legal right to life. And we would say that's unjust, it's not biblical, and the Supreme Court is wrong and doesn't reflect the Constitution. So those views hold a low value of life, but really lead us to this sort of two-story dualism where in one hand we would say, yes, we value this life, we value this mother if she wants her child, but on the other hand, if this mother does not want this child, then we don't value this life. And that is just an inconsistency that cannot be maintained. And so we're not going to maintain it, and we're not going to encourage you to maintain it either. We are going to be loving, we are going to be kind as we engage and respectful as we dialogue with people that we meet, and especially the women and men that are in these vulnerable situations to make sure we care for them well. So the last thing that I'll say, just to reiterate, the biblical perspective of value is based upon the imago Dei, the image of God that is imprinted on every human being, that holds that personhood is not exclusive from humanhood. They are one and the same. That body and soul are united from the very beginning and grow and mature together as every single one of us grows, even as we are continuing to grow, as we are working out our faith with fear and trembling. So again, big question is, what are the preborn? When should we call an embryo one of us? What is the decisive moment that a human being becomes a person? The biblical perspective of value, I'm going to say this again because we want to make sure that you get this, that this is really clear, is based upon the imago Dei. It's imprinted on every human being. It holds that personhood is not exclusive from humanhood. And the objective reality is that we're all developing humans and persons from the point of fertilization. If you go and look up the definition of human in any dictionary, you will find some connection to the word person. Those are not separate ideas. That is a completely new philosophical idea that has been thrown out there for decades now and has effectively justified the mass killing of 60 million preborn lives. So I know that that's weighty, and we want to give you a framework for how to think through some of these things, and that framework is an acronym, SLED.
So the S stands for size. And so basically when we're talking about the value of life and we're thinking about, is an embryo as valuable as a baby that's already born? And so we just, it's healthy to push back on, why does that matter? Am I less valuable than Bruce because clearly he is much larger than I am? No, I'm not less valuable than Bruce whatsoever. And so when they say, okay, well, at what point does the size, make a difference? Is it at 20 weeks when that baby it's illegal to be aborted in the state of Texas? Or at, 40 weeks when that baby is, viable to be born and be outside of the uterus? And so when they say the size of a baby, an embryo, is not a valid human, we just want to push back and say why. That makes zero sense. So the second letter is L, and that's level of development. So again, they're talking about a baby in utero is not fully developed as a baby that's ready to be born. And so why is that level of development? Why does that matter? And so in the book, The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf, he really unpacks this really well. And one of the things he talks about is trotting out the toddler. And so he's like, so this toddler clearly is at a lower level of development than a human. So is this toddler less valuable? Of course not. Would we think that toddler is expendable? Of course not. But they want to say that because a baby in uterus is at a lower level of development, somehow that is less valuable. So the next letter is E, and that is for environment. And so that just says, so is a baby in utero less valuable than a baby that is outside of the uterus? So why, if it travels the distance of the birth canal, does that change that baby's value? Again, I would just say that doesn't make a lot of sense. That doesn't make. And so if I am here on Earth, is that environment more important than somebody that is in space? That's a very different environment. And so we just want to say, hey, where that human being is located, it does not change its value whatsoever. And then the fourth letter is a D, and that's degree of dependency. And so obviously a baby that is in its mother's womb is going to be very, very dependent. But that baby that is born is going to be 100% dependent on that mother. That baby that is a toddler is 100% dependent for life on their parents. And so then you want to talk about, okay, so let's talk about someone that's insulin dependent. Is that life less valuable than someone that is not, or someone that's dependent on dialysis or some other medication? So a degree of dependency does not indicate their value. And so not listed on the slide is the fourth D. And so it's also helpful to think through is desirability. And so again, I just come back to, so if a mother is murdered and her unborn child is murdered, that is a double homicide. But yet, if she makes the choice to terminate her pregnancy, that is okay because that baby was not desired. And I just want to say that all life is valuable. So desirability is, again, just another thing that you want to think through. And we are not wanting you to be, masters in apologetics, but as you come through and you're talking with people about abortion and you want to be able to communicate with them in a clear, concise, and winsome way, these are just some things to have in your back pocket that would be helpful as you are working through this.
Yeah, you might not pull out SLED and be like, well, let me unpack this framework for you. You might just ask some really helpful questions, kind of using what we call the Columbo tactics to go, hey, how did you come to the conclusion that a child in the womb was less valuable or able to have their life ended than a child out of the womb? And then as you hear them maybe give an example or their reasoning behind how they came to that conclusion, then you might use one of these points within SLED to kind of go, okay, it sounds like what you're saying is that the level of development of a human being makes them expendable or not. So is a toddler more expendable than a teenager? Like, can you end a toddler's life but not a teenager's life? Or is a teenager more dependent than an adult? And does that then mean that their life could be ended? And so you start to break down some of the logic and just help them see clearly. And one other thing is, you're never going to win an argument, at least I haven't, in one sitting, right? And so remember that scriptures would tell us to be kind, respectful, gentle as we share truth, as people ask us to give the reason for the hope that we have. And you want to make sure that this isn't just how I can win an argument, how I can put somebody down or make them feel dumb because maybe they haven't thought through some of these things. Because honestly, there are a lot of really catchy ideas that are out there, like abortion is healthcare, is things that you just go, gosh, that healthcare sounds great. But when you start to connect the dots and actually unpack what that means, you go, that didn't make any sense. And we want to make sure that we are lovingly, thoughtfully caring for people, especially the women and men that you're going to be walking alongside. So thanks for joining us for session 2. We'll see you in session 3.